the station, there's just like walking through rubble.
I've been shot. Who died? 2-year-old baby, 9-year-old.
What's it like in there now, Doctor?
It's a war zone. There was still smoke in the air. You could still smell the Jet A fuel. It was just a horrific, horrific scene.
TWA 800, Oklahoma, Waco. Almost 500 deaths in 3 major U.S. disasters. Genuine accidents or political cover-ups? A question asked by some skeptical Americans who believe the blame for the tragedies can be traced straight to the heart of the U.S. government.
87 people are now believed to have died in Armenian religious sect at Waco in Texas.
48 bodies have been recovered from the ruins so far.
The White House said the fire was started deliberately by those inside after the FBI began a dawn
The question of who started the Waco fire remains open to debate. Mount Carmel had been the headquarters of a religious group called the Branch Davidians. Led by David Koresh, they were a breakaway section of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and believed that the apocalypse was imminent. A Justice Department inquiry blamed the cult members for starting the fire, but there's still a belief that it was deliberately started by US federal agents to destroy evidence that could be used against them. An unusual twist to the story.
The background people usually focus on is that Koresh was a religious man who was on the fringes of religious belief, and he was heavily armed because he believed that Armageddon was just around the corner. Well, a couple of things about that. To be heavily armed in Texas is not illegal, and it's not actually particularly unusual. And his religious beliefs were his religious beliefs.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms suspected David Koresh was keeping weapons and explosives stockpiled at his compound. By February 1993, the Bureau had a warrant for his arrest. In what would be a very public display of law enforcement, the ATF decided to mount a spectacular raid.
But the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms at that time was under a great deal of political pressure. There was talk of streamlining the government and maybe getting rid of ATF. They were desperate to find something they could do which would be headline grabbing and would prove that ATF was still necessary. Waco.
Police in Texas are still surrounding the headquarters of a religious cult.
6 people died in gun battles at the weekend.
The raid was a fiasco. David Koresh had been tipped off that the ATF were on their way. When the armed agents arrived, the Branch Davidians met them fully armed. With 6 people dead, 4 ATF agents and 2 cult members, both sides retreated and prepared for a standoff. The Waco rumor mill sprang into action.
It was a shambles, an absolute shambles. It was handled appallingly.
They had cameras rolling to record this. They planned on having a big public relations soiree with it.
Helicopters were used, and that became an issue. Then it became an issue of who fired first.
Miraculously, all these cameras had the lens caps on, or the tapes weren't in them. Key evidence that would prove who shot first has all disappeared.
The government fired through doors. Could not see who was behind those doors. Conspiracists say that this was an attempt to kill anybody who was inside there, women and children included.
What was the great crime that Koresh was supposed to have committed that would warrant an operation of that size?
With Koresh holding forth inside Mount Carmel, President Clinton replaced the ATF with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Its task? To coax the Branch Davidians into a peaceful surrender whilst keeping the public on the government's side.
Every day, the FBI came out and gave the federal spin on the day's news.
It was a bizarre exercise in media control.
And there was no contrary voice. We were getting one side of the story, and that was all.
It was frustrating, I think, trying to get any information, and it just seemed all so unnecessary.
Some believe that the FBI news reports were carefully worded so as to demonize David Koresh and his followers.
As a reporter, I watched how Waco was being reported. Neutral words were not being used. It talked about a cult, not about a religious sect.
Phrases like stockpiling weapons. There's no law in this country saying how many firearms anybody can own.
It talked about a compound, not a residence.
A phrase like assault weapon. I mean, that's a misuse of a military term.
They called bunkers a building that was a walk-in cooler. A tornado shelter was also called a bunker. The FBI invented all this terminology, and the press just picked it up from the FBI.
But other sections of the media believed the FBI's language was accurate.
It's certainly true that the vocabulary used by reporters to describe the scene there did have some value connotations. However, I do think that there was something most peculiar about the Branch Davidians. I mean, why else would people want semi-automatic weapons, and why would they believe in what they did believe? There's nothing wrong with believing it, but they did run themselves along the lines that we normally think of as being a cult.
In Texas, the siege continues at the headquarters of a religious cult.
It's now surrounded by 400 officers equipped with...
The siege dragged on throughout March and April '93, and the FBI, who'd spent weeks negotiating with Koresh, began to resort to less conventional methods of persuasion.
The Davidians were harassed during the 51-day standoff by psychological warfare tactics. And some of those involved horrendous sounds of rabbits being killed and slaughtered, and particularly loud music. One in particular was a foreshadowing of what was really going to happen, and that was the Nancy Sinatra record. Listen to the lyrics. You've been playing someplace you shouldn't be playing. One of these days you're going to get burned. I just got me a brand new box of matches. You know, one of these days these boots are going to walk all over you, and they did.
No one really knows the extent of the psychological tactics, but at dawn on April the 19th, President Clinton authorized the FBI's tanks to knock down the walls of the compound and fire in gas canisters in order to flush out the Branch Davidians.
At this point, we're not negotiating. We're saying come out. Come out with your hands up. We have given them various ultimatums. We are going to continue to press and press until this matter is over.
2 miles overhead, an FBI surveillance plane filmed the storming of the compound.
What you see in the film is a carefully constructed plan, which is very well executed, with people moving and firing in coordination with the tanks. That doesn't just happen. That's planned.
Military experts who've studied the film believe the bright lights illustrate multiple gunfire. When questioned in court, the FBI denied firing even one round into the compound.
My mother always told me, believe none of what you hear and half of what you see. And if you look at those flashes, they look like gunfire.
Hours after the gassing operation began, the building burst into flames in 3 different places. For 6 years, the FBI denied using anything that might have started a fire. However, in 1999, the Bureau admitted flammable tear gas had been used by their agents.
When I saw the end of the siege and the building go up in flames, I was appalled. Absolutely appalled, because I knew there were children in there.
Yesterday's action ended in a horrible human tragedy.
I was surprised that, given the most obvious bungling at the start, that it would also end in a bungle.
He killed those he controlled, and he bears ultimate responsibility for the carnage that ensued.
I have been told by a number of agents who were there that if the Davidians had walked out the first day, that the building would have burned down, because the physical evidence in the building, that is the bullet trajectories, this sort of thing, backed the Davidian story and not the government story.
He had those fires started. He had 51 days to release those children. He chose those children to die. We didn't have anything to do with their death.
I don't think that there was a plan to kill anybody in Waco. I don't believe that the federal agents ever expected that, including those who made the initial raid. I don't think they expected they would be fired on themselves. So it seems to me it's far more of a case of negligence than of malice.
The FBI has been non-helpful in providing any information that would help shine truth on what happened there, because they're covering up. They're spinning the story.
Despite the fact that official investigations cleared the actions of the ATF and the FBI, 7 years later the charred remains of Waco still act as a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. For some, the question of who is to blame will never be answered.
for grace. What awaits the storming of the complex?
Waco upset a great many people, especially white males. It set in motion a great protest movement called the Patriot Movement.
In the eyes of the Patriots, President Clinton was solely responsible for the events at Waco. They believed that his enthusiasm for gun control endangered everything they stood for.
Bill Clinton is a traitor. He has sold out the American people. He has trashed the Constitution. He has done everything to weaken this country instead of making it stronger. He has lied, he has schemed, he has done everything bad for this country.
And among the people who were in the Patriot Movement were some people who had military training and wanted to get even.
At Oklahoma, ex-soldier Timothy McVeigh did.
A huge explosion has devastated a government office block in Oklahoma City. Many people are reported to have been killed. The authorities say it was a bomb.
On the 19th of April 1995, 2 years to the day of the Waco fire, Oklahoma's federal building containing Army recruitment, Social Security, and ATF offices was blown up. 168 people died. Timothy McVeigh, a former US soldier, was charged with the bombing. Influenced by the anti-government rhetoric of militia groups, he's on record as saying he felt a huge wrong had been committed at Waco, and with the help of his friend Terry Nichols, he sought revenge. As details of the plot emerged, so did the conspiracy theories.
They drove a lot of explosives a very great distance. They got a parking space right outside the Oklahoma City Federal Building, and they blew it up, and they got away. But I talked to one witness who said he's as close as I'm sitting to you now to a truck in which there was McVeigh and there was another person who was not McVeigh's indicted co-conspirator. So, what do you make of that?
He had no idea what the size of this bomb was or what was going to go on in that building. He thought this was a kind of symbolic reminder of Waco and what had happened at Waco several years earlier on exactly the same day.
So if McVeigh was just a small cog, who else was involved?
The US government had an undercover agent that had penetrated the conspiracy before the bomb went off and had somehow lost control over the operation, bungled it, and they have very assiduously prevented this from coming out.
If you accept that, then the whole thing looks like a government conspiracy, but there's no hard and fast evidence. And in the case of the Oklahoma City bombing, I'm not convinced it's true.
The story alleges that a female undercover ATF informant had infiltrated a conspiracy among white separatists to blow up government buildings. Government agents categorically deny any prior knowledge that the federal building was to be targeted. Some are not convinced.
She told them who had done the bombing. She named them. But the FBI did not follow up her leads. They did not speak to the people that she named.
The government could have stopped it. They didn't. Whether that was by design, I don't know. At some level, it may have been. On a more simple level, it was a sting operation that went bad. And that's why it's being covered up by the government.
The Justice Department eventually disclosed it had an undercover informant inside a white separatist group. However, it continues to deny it knew anything about plans to blow up the federal building.
The bomb was supposed to go off at 3 in the morning, I think. And it's actually interesting that there were ATF people out loud that night. And there's a lot of evidence from the field in Oklahoma City that in fact they had been expecting some big event that night.
You had ATF and FBI agents that were in the surrounding buildings that descended on the scene of the bombing, their black flak jackets and their riot gear. They were in a stakeout, watching the building. So, of course, they had prior knowledge.
In August 1997, Timothy McVeigh was found guilty of planting the Oklahoma bomb and sentenced to death. Since then, there's been a new conspiracy theory that the government itself blew up the federal building.
I would not say that it was the U.S. government per se that bombed the building, but it was small black operations within the Pentagon, CIA, using lower-level cutouts such as Middle Eastern terrorists and eventually these rednecks. And that was the kind of triple or quadruple decker operation that Oklahoma City was.
It seems to me that there remains a possibility that there were other people involved in a conspiracy. On the other hand, there are those who believe there was a much wider conspiracy, that this was the federal government blowing itself up in order to introduce draconian powers to repress gun owners and other God-fearing people. Well, this is palpable nonsense.
But if the Oklahoma bomb was designed to damage the US government, oddly enough, it did the opposite. It offered the beleaguered president a political lifeline.
The shock was so great, and Clinton's ability to bring the nation together was so extraordinary, I think it saved his presidency. He was able to speak for all Americans.
This was the watershed moment in his political career, Clinton. It put him over the top. It got him elected the second time around.
A year after Oklahoma, President Clinton and the conspiracy theorists were having a quiet time. However, Flight TWA 800 was about to change that.
Investigation is launched into why a jumbo jet exploded off the east coast.
Search for the 229 people on board is continuing.
All the speculation seems to be terrorist-related.
Well, I was at my beach house, and I was coming out onto the deck in the evening, and I saw a flash. Then I saw another flash rise from the area of the horizon. There was a ship's light in the same area of the sky, and that flash seemed to go upward. At first, I saw what appeared to be an emergency flare, and then as I looked at it, I realized it was a lot more than a flare.
On the 17th of July, 1996, Flight TWA 800 took off from Kennedy Airport, New York, bound for Paris, with 230 passengers on board. 8 miles off the coast of Long Island, the 747 disappeared. Speculation as to what had caused the explosion was rife.
We know there was a catastrophic explosion. It's caused by some sort of a bomb.
As a result of lax airport safety.
Or something hit the plane from outside.
It was a missile that shot it down. From a training exercise.
Or a mechanical problem.
It might be a problem with the aircraft, design fault.
Or something in the cargo.
It was the government, it was terrorists, etc., etc. In the era of the internet, conspiracy theories always start very quickly, and this is what happened when TWA 800 crashed.
The answers to the tragedy lay under 120 feet of the Atlantic. The salvage operation would last 10 months. The investigation team's initial task, to find evidence of terrorist activity. But the first fragments yielded few clues. While the investigators continued their painstaking work, the rumor that TWA 800 had been hit by a missile was gathering momentum. Statements from more than 100 eyewitnesses fueled the theory.
My first impression was that I had witnessed a military exercise and that something went awry. The sound of the events started to shake the house. There was a rolling thunder and then the fireball. The rolling thunder seemed to be corresponding to a sonic boom.
There's no doubt that there were 2 missiles involved in this. One came from south to north. The other came from close inshore, within 4 or 5 miles of the shoreline, and came from north to south.
Some felt that the government knew TWA 800 had been hit by a missile or missiles, but was covering up. Federal agents, however, provided their own explanation for what the eyewitnesses believed they'd seen.
This massive catastrophe happened and a plane breaks up at altitude and the fuel starts burning and explosions occur. I mean, things are flying off this plane, up, down, sideways. Some of the witnesses could have seen some of those events.
But the missile theorists were not put off, especially when another piece of evidence emerged.
The key piece of evidence was residue from the back of seat 8, row 18. It was a piece of foam rubber with some reddish-orange residue on it. It's right above the point where the missile first entered the plane. I had a test done to find out what are the elements in the reddish residue. That is consistent with an incendiary warhead.
But again, there's a plausible explanation.
There isn't going to be any fuel from a missile strike. The missile disintegrates. So if there is a missile theory, I actually don't believe that there's going to be any residue that's going to be left in a piece of foam that's fallen into the Atlantic Ocean and been there for a while.
The 18-month investigation carried out by the National Transportation Safety Board reported the crash of TWA 800 had been caused by an explosion in the central fuel tank.
The combined FBI-ATF laboratory conclusion was that, one, there was no evidence of high explosive damage.
When I heard that the explanation was mechanical, I didn't accept it, only because I saw that there were many other events in the sky that resulted in the explosion of the aircraft.
Two, there was no evidence of explosion of a missile warhead.
Objects came from a great distance close to shore, intersected with the path of the plane. Another object rose from the sea.
Three, there was no evidence of missile impact.
Obviously, they were outside events that happened with the explosion of this aircraft. It did not come from a mechanical explosion inside.
There's no question that the government has decided to give a politically contrived answer to what brought down Flight 800.
With the US government standing firmly behind the conclusion of their investigation, some Americans believe they are covering up a huge military blunder. Their frustration is obvious.
In terms of major media coverage of my investigation of the government, I have been absolutely, completely, totally shut out.
There might be a lot of reasons for that as to why the media is not grabbing this. And, you know, I don't know how to explain that.
Waco, Oklahoma, TWA 800. According to the skeptics, 3 examples of US government cover-ups. The skeptics point to a history of official misinformation, hidden agendas, and downright lies, and believe no credibility can ever be given to the government line.
Conspiracy theories will develop as long as the governments do not investigate it and inform in a forthright manner.
Governments have a long documented history of deceiving the people, and I think that it's always a good thing for people who are not in power to question authority, and that's basically what conspiracy theories are. They're questioning, you know, the official stories that we get, and so I think, you know, I hope they will always be around, and I'm positive that they will.